The Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast is brought to you by Higher Gravity, a craft beer bar located in Cincinnati, Ohio in the North Side and Blue Ash neighborhoods. And I don't know about you, Mike, but this is my go-to bar. It's my walking distance bar. It's the best selection of beer in the city bar. It is the Mug Club bar. It is the best draft selection bar. It's the best to-go beer bar. And frankly, the best bartender's bar.
I love the one in Northside because it is a fantastic place. There is a massive amount of beers on tap, a great bottle selection. I love it, man. Hard to find a place that still really loves beer, and they do it.
And it's for that reason, we'll see you there. We'll be at the bar.
We'll be at the bar.
Hello. Welcome to another Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast. My name is Brett Coleman Baker, owner and brewer at Urban Artifact in Cincinnati, Ohio. And more importantly, I am here with the one and the only Michael Morgan. Mike, how are you?
Not necessarily more important, but definitely better looking and fantastic. It's Friday. Good to see you, my friend.
Thank goodness. Cheers to that.
Once again, this week, we are punching way above our weight. The past couple of episodes, both Renee and Fritz mentioned the Smithsonian and the fact that Jack McAuliffe and Fritz Maytag, along with a bunch of other of the real influential people in the history of craft beer, have been inducted into the Smithsonian. Their objects.
The Smithsonian. For those of you listening, we're talking about the Smithsonian.
Yeah. Like the actual museum in Washington, D.C., the National Museum of American History. So we are talking to Dr. Theresa McCulla today. Dr. McCulla is the curator of the American Brewing Institute, which is dedicated principally to the history of modern craft beer. And Dr. McCulla her educational background, pretty much identical to yours and mine. She has a BA, an MA, and a PhD from Harvard. You graduated from Ohio University, and I barely graduated from Ohio University.
I was arrested 3 times.
That is impressive. I was only arrested there twice. I do have a law degree, I'm told, but yeah.
Did you say log degree?
A log degree, maybe. I thought it was law, but I will go home and reread the diploma. But Dr. McCulla developed this specialization throughout really a truly impressive academic career of 19th and 20th century culinary and drink American history. And that's how she wound up getting what is one of the absolute best gigs in America today.
I really don't know how it gets better doing what she's doing. Literally a patriotic act of recording the history of American craft beer for future Americans to love, learn, and understand.
Yeah, I have enjoyed doing what we're doing here and putting together, this history of craft. But she is doing that on a much larger scale for the purposes of posterity, of Americans today and to come, for the government, for us, for the country. And that is really fucking cool.
Yeah, it makes me feel like what we're doing is like a fart in the wind, but that's okay. And on that note, Dr. McCulla, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you both for having me.
Dr. McCulla, you, as we just discussed in this intro, have what sounds like a really cool job and a very impressive title. You are tasked with compiling the history of American craft beer for the Smithsonian. That's a big deal. It's also interesting that the Smithsonian decided that craft beer is worthy of its own entire initiative. What made the Smithsonian decide that craft beer is worthy of this kind of attention in our collective history?
Well, so the American Brewing History Initiative started at the National Museum of American History in early 2017, and you're right. I think in my mind, as an American, the Smithsonian stage, the American History Museum, it means to me that the stories that are told in that museum are stories of our entire national story. So I remember growing up and going to the museum and seeing things like Dorothy's ruby slippers from the Wizard of Oz or Abraham Lincoln's top hat, and now beer and craft beer very much has a home at the American History Museum. And I always like to say that beer has a place at the Smithsonian and at the American History Museum because you can really think about any era, any event in American history through the lens of beer. So if you want to talk about immigration or technology or consumer culture or gender roles, beer is really relevant in all of those fields. More specifically, how it came about is that we have an advisory group called the Kitchen Cabinet to our food history project at the American History Museum. And my colleagues at the museum have done just a wonderful job collecting, especially the history of American cuisine, American food, and American winemaking. And I don't know if it was about 10 years or so ago, Kim Jordan from New Belgium Brewing Company, who is on the Kitchen Cabinet, said, essentially, where's the beer? That beer is the most popular alcoholic beverage in the US and has been for much of our nation's history. And it wasn't quite represented to an equal extent on the floor of the museum and in our collections. And so she worked through her advisory role with us, but also through the Brewers Association to see that a very generous gift from the Brewers Association came to the museum. And so my charge since I was hired, 4 years ago, has been to essentially build a new collection related to the history of homebrewing and craft beer in the U.S. From around the 1960s to the present.
One of the things that I think is fascinating about your work is that we have this very long history as a nation from even before America's America. Beer is part of it. But what you're doing skips over all of the 18th and 19th century and even predominantly skips over the boring beer part of American history and focuses predominantly on the modern American craft beer movement. Is that correct?
Well, it's accurate for sure to say, my research and collecting in terms of building new collections, very much focuses on the recent past and the present of beer. But I think, and you know this very well as a historian, I've certainly found that everything we are experiencing now stands on the shoulders of what happened before us. And so, we can talk about craft beer and microbrewing now, but so much of what is interesting about that relates to what happened decades or even centuries before. And so, I find all the time I draw on the collections that already existed at the museum before I arrived there, related to, the advertising culture of beer in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We have a wonderful little collection of brewing equipment from the late 1800s and the same time period, early 1900s. So the past, the history of beer is still very relevant and very interesting and rich in our present too.
The first couple of interviews we did were with Renee, who is Jack McCullough's daughter, and Fritz Maytag. And both of these guys wind up with this title of the father of craft beer.
They both arguably have claims to the quote-unquote title.
Right.
And we all know that most of the time, you can't have two fathers.
So, Dr. McCulla, who is the father of craft beer?
I think it's well recognized in general knowledge of our brewing history that this kind of key moment in our sea change in American beer was when Fritz Maytag purchased Anchor Brewing Company, and that was in 1965. And Anchor was a long-standing brewery. It was founded in the 1800s in San Francisco, and we know the story of Fritz. He was the heir to the Maytag Company family fortune, and he described coming to San Francisco to go to school at Stanford, first as an undergraduate and then a graduate student, and not really being that interested in beer, not liking beer so much, but he described himself as an alchemist, that he, was given this microscope by his dad when he was a teenager, and he had a basement lab at their home in Iowa. And just, he said he loved tinkering. And when he was directed toward this failing Anchor Brewing Company in 1965, he described walking into the brewery and looking around and just being entranced by all the brewing equipment around him, that he was really kind of taken by the space and by the things that filled the brewery. And so he took on Anchor as this kind of project to fix, because it was kind of, struggling along, and had a problem with kind of persistently spoiled batches of beer. And so this microscope that his dad had given him as a teenager, he brought that same microscope into the brewery, and put slides of beer under the microscope, and peered down into it to see what was growing in the beer. And that was the kind of critical tool that he used to start fixing Anchor beer, and slowly but surely kind of turning the entire ship of American beer. And I'm very pleased to say that microscope is actually now on display at the American History Museum. He donated it to the Smithsonian in 2018. It was one of the first items that I was able to bring in. So that was a key moment. But I think a lot of credit needs to be given beyond our borders, actually, that we, American craft beer, American microbrewed beer, has been an incredible cultural and economic phenomenon. But what really inspired that from the beginning, in the UK, was the campaign for real ale. There was, similarly a movement toward a return to more artisanal brewing techniques, traditional ingredients, that was happening in the UK in the 1960s. And when some Americans went overseas in the mid 20th century, whether that was for military service or for educational purposes, they discovered this world of beer out there. Whether it was in England or Scotland or Belgium or Germany, and these styles that just did not exist in America at the time. And so it was this inspiration that happened elsewhere, and people brought brewing equipment, homebrewing manuals home with them to the U.S. and then started kind of tinkering at small scales in their basements or their garages. And Jack McAuliffe is, if Fritz Maytag is kind of chapter one of American microbrewed beer, Jack McAuliffe is chapter two, and he was serving for the U.S. Navy as an engineer in Scotland in the 1960s, and was very taken by the beer that he enjoyed at the pub next door to him in Scotland, bought homebrewing equipment, bought homebrewing manuals, and brought these things back to the U.S. and then settled in California and founded New Albion Brewing Company in Sonoma in 1976. And that was, if Fritz revitalized Anchor Brewing Company to be a first microbrewery of one kind, Jack did that in a different way at New Albion by building New Albion from the ground up. And then it was just, it was kind of off from there with a few diversions along the way.
I can't believe Fritz had that microscope that long in his possession that he was able to donate it in 2018. That's a long time.
Yeah, but he described it as one of his most prized possessions, and to the extent that it was, when he donated it to the museum, and he donated it along with several other things, like his set of his white Anchor coveralls, which if you've been to Anchor or San Francisco, you've seen the brewers there. They still wear these white coveralls that are very much a trademark of the brewery. But yeah, the microscope was such a special thing to him that the historian at Anchor Brewing Company, Dave Burkhart, did not. Normally when the American History Museum accepts donations of really special items, valuable items, they're packed by fine arts shippers, and they're shipped, from wherever in the country come to DC. But the historian Dave would not let it be shipped. He wanted to accompany it to DC, and so he, brought it with him on the airplane, and essentially flew it to Washington himself. And when he was staying at the hotel, he brought it to breakfast with him in the hotel, that morning, and then hand delivered it to the museum. So I think that's a wonderful example of, I'm very aware of how precious these stories and these things are that people share with the museum. And by doing that, they're sharing them with everyone, with the public.
Prohibition ends in 1933, and alcohol becomes legal again, but home brewing doesn't. And home brewing stays illegal until 1978 in the Carter administration.
Yeah, that change had the biggest single impact on the culture in America around beer and led to the explosion of craft like no other single legislative change in our country's federal history.
And I got to say that that's one of the things that I'm really looking forward to unraveling, because I don't really understand. Number one, I mean, when I hear like legal, illegal, I started out, and I've got to admit, I probably should have known better by the time we started this, but I started out with the assumption that until 1978, nobody was making their own beer, right? Because it was illegal. You don't do that. But
no, I definitely don't grow marijuana in my basement either.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot like that. Like, people were doing it all over the place. And by the time you hit 1978, unless you're in Mississippi, nobody really gives a shit. But it is still technically illegal. So that puts limitations on a lot of things. And unraveling this connection between a homebrew hobby and how that changes the commercial beer industry, that's a really fascinating question that I still don't understand.
Dr. McCulla, I'm curious for your insights around homebrewing being legalized and the impact it had on craft beer.
Right. So it's this funny quirk of our history and of American brewing history, the long-term illegal nature of homebrewing. You know, after the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, it was okay to make wine at home and cider, but not beer. And the reason for that was about a kind of anxiety about the potential misuse of wort, essentially distilling spirits at home, rather than responsibly producing small quantities of beer. But it certainly took legislative action. The House resolution in 1978, went into effect in 1979 that made it legal again. But there are some newsletters from early homebrew clubs like the Maltose Falcons in Los Angeles that talk about this kind of enthusiasm for efforts to legalize homebrewing. And Charlie Papazian, who by that time was in Boulder, he had already self-published The Joy of Brewing, and once homebrewing was legalized, things were kind of ready to go. He founded the American Homebrewers Association right away, and then published his homebrewing book, with a bigger press just a few years after that. So, prior to that key moment of legalization, I think the legality of homebrewing was one factor that kind of limited the growth of the hobby. It made it, this kind of intriguing underground thing that you could do. But more practically speaking, what kept limiting brewing, until it was legal, was just the availability of things like ingredients and small scale brewing equipment. And so a lot of early homebrewers had to rely on winemaking shops, and there just was not really a network of ways to learn about brewing, to procure good hops or good malt, things like that.
It was definitely cooler then. You could easily argue that when it was illegal, it was way more badass than it is now.
Yeah, right.
But the ability to get good ingredients, I mean, it sounds to me like there were a fair number of people that were homebrewing when it was illegal, and it's not like there were SWAT raids,
No.
Hitting their houses. It sounds to me more like, it was kind of a supply issue that, you can't advertise home brewing supplies on any kind of large scale if it's technically illegal to do it.
Right. I think, yes, it was a supply issue. And then, also just simply a kind of a palate and culture issue as well. I mean, was there really a broad demand for what we now know as IPAs or porters? Not so much. I think, a lot of the very early microbrewers talk about kind of bringing beer drinkers along with them as they introduced things like, the bitterness of hops, or kind of a dark malt to beer drinkers. There just was not even yet a lot of familiarity with those kinds of things either.
So you've explained in part, why and how we get some of these early breweries, early craft breweries in California, focusing on ales and English styles. But why California? I mean, was it just how influential was Fritz in that um, explosion of craft brewing in California in the 70s? And how much of it was just, it was California? There was crazy stuff going on.
Right. He was very influential, and there were a lot of other super important components that all kind of fell into place, in the right place at the right time. So Fritz, for his very long career at Anchor, he was there from 1965 to 2010. From the start, was very generous, with not just with advice, but actually sharing ingredients with other small brewers who, eventually began to pop up in the area. So people like Jack McAuliffe in Sonoma. I flew down to Arkansas to record an interview with Jack, the spring of 20, I guess it was spring of 2019. And he even at this late time, he remembered still Fritz as being a very generous figure, in his early start, at New Albion. And the same goes for Ken Grossman, who started at Sierra Nevada, of course, who was drawn to Anchor, but also to New Albion. But there were some other really important factors in the region. One of them, for sure, was UC Davis and Michael Lewis, the longtime professor of brewing science there, who trained so many of these homebrewers and professional brewers, some who went on to found their own small breweries, but others who went on to brew at Anheuser-Busch and large breweries throughout the country. I think also really important is the success of the wine industry in the area at the time. So in the 60s and 70s, wine had really kind of kicked off this enthusiasm for the idea of terroir and of a kind of, a taste of place that was just beginning to be appreciated by Americans in a new way. And so you've got wine, you've got food going along with it. Alice Waters opened Chez Panisse. When I interviewed Ken Grossman, he said that Chez Panisse in Berkeley, this restaurant focusing on local seasonal foods, was the first restaurant account to serve Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, and he hand delivered his pale ale to Alice Waters so she could put it on the menu there. So and then as you mentioned, just California being California, the kind of counterculture, and movements of people who were eager to do things like bake their own bread or make their own cheese or make their own beer. And that's why you see home brewing and early microbrewing pop up also in places like Colorado, New England, where these various aspects of our kind of social and cultural history were present.
So is this kind of like the Venetian glassblowers, where you have this congregation of education and the right culture, and you just get this explosion of talent?
I think it's this interesting blend of of people and resources and setting. And when I interviewed Fritz, he had this intriguing theory too, which was he focused on the climate of Northern California and tied it to the climate of the Mediterranean. And he had a very funny line in his interview where he said something like, in New England or the Midwest, where it's so freezing cold, you've got to spend all your time staying warm or chopping wood or something. Whereas, in the paradise that's Northern California, you're free to just kind of wander around and have inspired ideas or whatever. So, yeah. So,
Or fight fires.
Right, yeah. But I had a similarly kind of interesting conversation recently with Oscar Wong and Leah Wong Ashburn from Highland Brewing Company in Asheville, North Carolina. And of course, Asheville has, within the last 10, 15 years, become the kind of East Coast epicenter of craft beer with, big breweries like New Belgium or Sierra Nevada. Their East Coast facilities are there, but then just this proliferation of other smaller craft breweries there. And I asked them, what is it about this part of North Carolina that's so special, so unique? And they pointed out too that, the Asheville area has this history and tradition of maker culture, that people in the region, in addition to, there being good water, kind of favorable legislation for craft breweries, there's a kind of proclivity to enjoy handmade or artisanal products, and that might be beer, it might be furniture, it might be something else.
Geographically, where does craft start to move from California? I mean, is it kind of following where you have, for lack of a better term, foodie culture? I mean, we see it in California, we see Colorado. Is it then the East Coast where we really start to see the next major influential craft breweries?
I think also the Pacific Northwest. So, Seattle was an early epicenter as well, Colorado too, and then New England. And there's kind of bits and pieces in different parts of the country. But, it's really in the 80s, mid 80s, that you see it kind of pick up, and it picks up just, in part because of increased media attention, consumer attention, consumer wealth. I mean, if you think of the 80s as a time when certain people had more disposable income, and if this kind of new style of beer, new approach to making beer was, a way to kind of, flaunt your savvy as a consumer, or as a diner or drinker. That was appealing as well. And those factors together also compelled easier access to capital, to investment in beer. And so those were the kinds of forces that really helped beer pick up in the 80s and then onward.
We had a conversation with Jack McCulla's daughter, and I'd like to get your opinion on what's the difference between Jack McCulla, who is an absolute pioneer, sounds like he was making good beer, and Ken Grossman, who's doing almost the identical thing 2 hours away. Mm-hmm. One of them goes bankrupt and one of them becomes a billionaire. Are there lessons that you learned, or are there patterns that really kind of defined who from that era made it and who didn't?
Well, I think if you're especially thinking of those two, the answer came to me very directly from Michael Lewis, the professor at UC Davis, who said immediately it's a question of scale. That you have multiple people saying that Jack McCulla, when he opened, he was working at such a small scale that he could never hope to earn a profit, really, unless he expanded. And that Ken Grossman, from the start, had a much better grasp of the scale that was necessary to turn a profit, to grow. So that's a short answer. Yeah.
It's a good answer. Yeah, I mean, I guess I get the impression in speaking to Jack's daughter that it was like he understood problems that he had with scale. Mm-hmm. So that makes a lot of sense. That, he seemed to have been frustrated by the fact that he couldn't access the capital that he wanted to grow in the way that he wanted. So that answer, I'm going to say you nailed it.
What I have found a really intriguing component of New Albion's history is the fact that Jack had two women co-founders, Susie Dennison and Jane Zimmerman. And we know Jack's name, and by we, I mean beer enthusiasts, beer historians, and thanks to the research of people like Maureen Ogle and Tom Acitelli, they were the ones who really brought Susie and Jane's names kind of back into the conversation with their recent books. And so I flew to Seattle to interview Susie, and she lives in Seattle, and she gave me her recollection of the founding years of New Albion. She was there for the entire extent of the brewery's run, and she and Jane both invested in the brewery from the start. They provided funding to found the brewery. She said Jack was interested in her being involved from the start because she had a minivan, and he needed a way to and she said, Jack taught her and Jane how to brew. And so on many days, Jack was not at the brewery. He was attending to other business. And so New Albion beer was being brewed by these two women, by Jane and Susie, who were both mothers in their 30s, if not. I think Susie was actually in her 40s. She had 3 kids at the time. She was divorced. Susie and Jane also did the drove the beer around, and they distributed it and brought it to customers. And so Susie had she had a different recollection that there were investors who were interested in funding an expansion of New Albion, but that Jack, his approach to business was kind of unyielding in certain respects, and that it was kind of a matter of maybe personality that didn't allow them to get access to the funding they needed to expand. So it sounds like it's interesting that interviews with various people who were involved at the time could offer kind of different takes on that.
One of the things about this Jack McCulla New Albion story that kind of blows me away is how he had these two female partners. Susie is a just integral part of the New Albion story. I mean, we even have, there's this story about Don Barclay that founded Mendocino Brewing, which is another one of the really early important craft breweries. And he got his start at New Albion, and he goes there and he asks Jack McCullough if he can be a free, unpaid intern. And Jack McCullough tells him to fuck off and get out of his office. And, the guy has, to his credit, he's got the temerity to come back. And this time he runs into Susie. And Susie says, sure, absolutely, we would love the free labor. And that, I think, is like, it's part of the juxtaposition of those two people. That Susie was the one that had a better business sense. She was the diplomat. She was the one that played a critical role in keeping him alive as long as they were. But she just gets lost in the whole thing. And we wind up with this story of just this one guy named Jack McCullough. And I got to say, as a guy, it kind of disgusts me a little bit. I mean, it really kind of is some patriarchal bullshit. And it's a sad aspect of that story.
I give credit to Maureen Ogle and Tom Achitelli for tipping me off, but I think just these histories just further enrich the story of New Albion, and also the story of craft beer, and the story of Northern California at the time. So the more perspectives, the more voices, the better.
I'm curious. I don't really, I guess, have a question here, but I think it's interesting that in the 70s, when craft beer was getting born and all of this creativity was starting to bubble out, we saw basically a beer monoculture forming where regional breweries were closing and the big behemoths were consolidating, and 99% of Americans would have not known of anything other than your standard American light lager. Mm-hmm. Do you think this is, I mean, there's no way that can be like a thing that's just unique to craft. Do you craft beer, that is? Do you see this? Has this happened before? Do you think it's going to happen again? I'm just really, it's just really strange to me. But at the time when basically the least amount of choice was possible, the most amount of choice was fomenting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting way to put that. I mean, certainly, home brewing in the beginning of microbrewing were very much this backlash against exactly how homogenized big beer had become. That there was this dearth of choice when beer drinkers went to the store. I think there was a sense that your choices were light adjunct lager or light adjunct lager or light adjunct lager, and there were previous eras when in the late 1800s, very early 1900s, the American brewing industry actually underwent a similar time period of consolidation and kind of reduction in very small local breweries. And so the 1960s, 1970s was not the very first time when this happened. It was actually the second time. But yeah, I do think the reaction against big beer was to kind of realize that I can do this at home. I want to do this at home, and that was part and parcel with the consumer movement of the 1970s. That in more than one respect, Americans resisted kind of participating in the economy in the way that they felt like they were being told to do. And so making your own beer, again, like baking your own bread, was one way to kind of fight the man, if you will.
So what you're saying is we're due up for another consolidation in about 10 years.
Certainly, if you look at the graph of American breweries, number of American breweries, we are and have been in uncharted territory for years now. I mean, I think the current count is over 8,000 active breweries, and the numbers in the last 15 years have been the growth has been so extraordinary, and certainly the pandemic has thrown a giant wrench into what was already a kind of a very challenging situation. I think before COVID, I mean, well, even now, the way that American beer has grown in the last 10, 15 years, interestingly, I think is really, it's almost a reversion to a kind of pre-prohibition model of very many very small breweries who are serving very local consumers. Breweries that rely on tap rooms, rely on people coming to breweries and drinking beer on draft, and many breweries not packaging. I mean, that's an old model of beer, of American beer, which is interesting, but it's very difficult, so challenging when you've got a pandemic that is keeping us from going to those tap rooms and sitting down and having a beer.
That's a really good point. It's almost a regression to the pre-prohibition mean within beer. It kind of
But regression is loaded, right? Because they were making better beer. I mean, it might not have been those 19th century beers because of ingredients, because of technology. We probably would have hated them, but from a style standpoint, there was a lot more. There was a lot more that was going into care of ingredients and brewing and diversity of styles. So, the beer in terms of what they were able to make at the time, you got a lot more diversity out of that 19th century period before you start heading into consolidation and, in the very late 1800s, early 1900s. So, yeah, I know what you're saying, but we're regressing to something that I think is preferable. If that made sense. Maybe that was just a random tirade. I don't know. I'm sorry. Finish your thought. What a dick. I just interrupt you to make nonsensical rambling statements, Brett.
I don't disagree at all. So the impact of prohibition is more than just cool stories about mafiosos in the 1920s. It's a story about lost culture, and we've destroyed vineyards and orchards and heritage apple trees that we'll never get back, and we'll never know what kind of cider our country was making because they just literally don't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. At one point in time, New York was the capital of the country in terms of grape output and wine output. Then eventually Missouri took over that title. And nowadays, if you have somebody talking about wine in our country and it's not California wine, they're basically going to think you're crazy and that they can't make good wine, which isn't the case at all. So what I'm curious...
It's mostly the case.
Well, but what I'm really curious about is to hear about what kind of similar cultural damage did Prohibition do to beer? And Dr. McCulla, could you enlighten us, please?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So, yes, and you're totally right about, the impact, the kind of permanent impact on vineyards and on orchards. I think some of the kind of long-standing results of prohibition with regard to beer are not quite so. They're in different formats, and so certainly something like the development of the three-tier system and the distributors being inserted into beer production and the way that beer gets to consumers, that didn't happen right after prohibition, but in the aftermath of prohibition, that was certainly something that is very much important today. I mean, I think also the fact that the way prohibition was repealed, the federal government left it to each state to figure out how they wanted to repeal it. And so, it was that decision that has created this patchwork nature of laws, in different states related to alcohol production. And I spoke with Linus Hall at Yazoo Brewing Company in Nashville, and he told me about growing up in Mississippi, and how Mississippi and Alabama homebrewing was not legal there until 2013. That Linus, when he started to brew, had to procure a distiller's license in order to brew beer. I want to say above 6% alcohol. It's just wherever you live, there's a different history, a different kind of approach to the way alcohol is produced and regulated and sold, and all of those little quirks can really be traced back to prohibition. On the topic of palate and the kind of lasting effects of prohibition, I think people pointed out that if prohibition meant that it was the big regional or national breweries that were able to kind of wait out the dry years, and what they were producing were these light lager styles. I think that points to the fact that those breweries then the palate for American beer became one that was looking for a very light, bland, easy drinking beer, and so it was almost a kind of Americans forgot how to enjoy beer that was a bit more complex, or kind of maltier or bitter, until microbrewers brought that back into the scene.
So if we can kind of skip ahead to the 1990s for a second, we have this idea, this assumption that Brett and I have been working under, that there was a kind of a die-off that occurred in the 1990s. And it wasn't consolidation, it was more these breweries that came and went. And it feels to us like a lot of craft breweries were founded in the 80s and went under in the 90s. And we kind of, regressed in terms of progress of craft beer for a while until it caught back up. But is that true? I mean, did that really happen, or is that just something that kind of we saw here regionally that we're projecting onto the rest of the country?
No, it's accurate that, yes, it's considered that there was a kind of initial industry shakeup in the early 2000s, and I think some writers or historians or economists have seen that after this kind of initial enthusiasm and infusion of investment in microbrewed beer in the 1980s and early 90s, that some brewers expanded too quickly and maybe weren't producing a kind of quality, consistent product that was built for the long haul. So I think it's considered to have been a kind of correction, among some breweries that just weren't maybe either producing the kind of consistent product, or weren't quite calibrated to the consumer demand in their particular area. So I think in the much more recent past, I think there's been a question about just the sheer number of breweries, and is there such a thing as a kind of saturated market? And one major difference between now and between then is I think we are just, aside from the pandemic, if you take that out of the picture, is we're just at such a different scale. Again, the number of breweries being topping 8,000 is it's a very different landscape even in the 1990s or early 2000s.
My recollection, and that's always suspect, but I think that late 1800s, the number that I recall was somewhere over 4,000 breweries nationally, and that dropped to something like 1,400 shortly before Prohibition. Does that sound about right to you?
I think that sounds, yeah.
So, if that's right, then we're talking about around about twice as many breweries as we had at, that kind of early peak of the 19th century. That in and of itself is kind of frightening.
It's a big number, sure, and you'd have to correct, of course, for population growth and all that. But yeah, I mean the very large number of breweries, and again, the very large majority of those are considered small businesses. They're producing for local populations, people in their city or maybe their region, but I mean, Brett has a pulse of this more than any of us, being a brewer, but I think certainly I found when I've traveled around the country that I hear that the current moment is very challenging, especially for breweries that have grown to the regional scale who distribute to some extent, maybe not nationally, but have grown enough that they find themselves competing with other brands, and with the big brands too. And it's not the very small breweries who are serving in their tap room or, working with local points of sale, but it's kind of this mid-level that's getting very squeezed from below and from above, in the current moment.
I mean, that's what I've seen. I agree 100%. Actually, you really just gave me a spark of inspiration there where in like 20 more years, we're going to have, instead of dive bars, we're going to have dive breweries. And I can't wait for that.
Yeah, I dig it.
Neighborhood dive breweries. Just the guy's been, or who the brewer, the proprietor has just been brewing for 30 years at the same joint, just fucking mad at the world, just pissed as hell. Just like, fuck it, I live upstairs. I don't give a shit. It's $5 pints. It's 2040. Inflation's out of control. $5 is basically 5 cents now. And it's great.
I like it, but I hear a lot of projecting going on there, Brett. I see you 30 years from now living on top of that church and, just bitter.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
So, Theresa, right now you've got, this job that you have, I think it's important. It also sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
You get to travel around the country and interview fascinating people, and you also get to collect things, right?
Yes. I totally agree with that. It's been just a blast, and it's to travel and to the best part of the job is to be able to sit down and have the gift of people's time and turn on my recorder and have them tell me about their path and their career, and just to listen to all the incredible variety of stories of all the people who make beer so creative and dynamic today. And then to think about the kind of material angle of it. If we wanted to kind of preserve this history at the museum, what are the ways that we could do it? What kinds of things would we collect to do that?
What are your favorite items? A few things that you've really enjoyed being able to pick up.
Let's see. It's hard to choose my favorites. I think one of the let's see, Michael Lewis, this professor who I mentioned at UC Davis, he donated to the museum his textbook, his brewing science textbook that he co-authored, and until just a few months ago, until right before he donated it, he continued to use this copy of his textbook as his teaching text when he was in the classroom in the brewing lab. And so when he mailed this book to the museum, the binding was totally broken, and all the pages were held together by like when you buy asparagus bunches, they've got those little purple rubber bands, or it was the book was held together by one of those little rubber bands, and the pages were just they're covered with circles from his coffee mugs and his scribblings in the margins, and it was just page after page, it was just this kind of expression of a teacher in the classroom, and the kind of use for page after page. I mean, the Smithsonian loves to collect objects that really, they kind of contain the story within themselves. They show their use, and so you might talk about Michael Lewis's book, or Charlie Papazian, who donated what he calls his charismatic spoon. His long loved homebrewing spoon that he used for so many years to teach so many people how to brew. And so when he sent that to the museum, it's this cheap spoon that he got at a Kmart or a hardware store in Boulder, and probably cost $2 or even less. And it's darkened from the many batches of beer, and you can tell from the wear. I love this. You can tell from the wear on the spoon that he's right-handed because of how the spoon stirred the pot. It's worn on one side but not the other because literally because of his use of it.
Nice.
So things like that, or Susie Dennison of New Albion. I came to her in Seattle, and in her home, she pulled out this box of things, and she said, here's a bottle of our ale and porter and stout, and the beer was still in the bottles, and the labels were
Wow.
Oh my
immaculate, and that is the beginning of American craft beer. Sitting there and now sitting safely in our museum, and so things like that just are they feel so exciting and so important.
That's really cool.
What's your favorite American craft brewing historical anecdote?
Oh God. My favorite American craft brewing historical. I mean, it's a pretty the thing I mentioned earlier about Sierra Nevada Pale Ale being served first by Alice Waters. I think that's a kind of that's a good one. I'm trying to think of
I mean, that's just classic capitalism wrapped up
right.
into a nice story. It's beautiful.
It's true. It's true. I think let's see. This is not to answer. This is not an anecdote, but I get asked sometimes, what are the kind of more interesting or unusual oral histories that I've recorded or things I found along the way. And one interview that was so fascinating and unexpected. I visited AJS Tap Handles in Random Lake, Wisconsin, north of Milwaukee. It's this little factory on the side of the road, and this company manufactures 80% of the tap handles that you see in a tap room or a bar or a brewery in the U.S. And so I had this, I got to tour the factory floor, and then I had this really cool conversation with the designer there, who used to be a graphic designer for Kohl's and then quit there and now works at this place. And it was a conversation about the look of craft beer. What is the look of craft beer? What is the look of big beer? Because they design tap handles for big breweries too. So I mean, that was a really fascinating conversation, because they very much understood the tap handle to be this kind of it's like initial line of conversation between someone who's standing there trying to figure out what to order, and then behind all of that, the brewer and the brewery, and what you're trying to get at with the to kind of attract the consumer and to kind of communicate who you are. And so that was a very cool conversation.
Oh, that is neat, because there's a lot of craft brewers who it's hard to look inward and be, who am I? How do I distill it down into a tap handle and then express it out? So to be able to do that and look at these breweries and distill their essence for them into a tap handle, that's really cool. I bet that was great.
It was, yeah. And they mentioned, and maybe you can relate to this with your beer, but they mentioned that craft brewers often request kind of natural looking or feeling materials like stone or wood, or handles that are designed to look handmade. Whereas they said, when they make handles for the really big companies, say Miller Lite or whatever, that those companies, all they care about is getting the name out there. They want the consumer to see the name, the letters. That's because that is the recognition that's that they're going for. But it's more kind of a look or feel, kind of an aesthetic for the others.
It's always been a combo of both for us. Of if someone's on the other side of the bar or across the bar looking at the tap handles, they got to be able to see it. But yeah, you can't just have it look like cheap ass plastic like Miller Lite or something.
Right.
Not saying that they use cheap plastic, but I'm guessing they do.
Right.
Theresa, it's been a blast.
Thank you for having me. It's been really fun to talk.
Happy travels and happy picking, Dr. McCulla.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was a great interview, and I can't wait to break it down. But before we do that, let's hear a word from the people that help make this podcast happen. And that actually includes you out there listening. So don't forget to like and subscribe, because it does matter. Thanks.
This podcast was brought to you in part by Beechwood Audio. Beechwood Audio provides sound acquisition and post-editing services. From projects ranging from corporate messaging, commercials, to full-feature films, as well as shorts and documentaries. For more information, contact Adam at soundfilmvideo.com.
So what I found really fascinating is the fact that it's basically ridiculous in an entirely silly conversation to talk about who the singular founder of craft beer was. There is no father of craft beer. Sure, you could argue maybe there's two daddies of craft beer, and my two daddies of craft beer. Here we go. Whatever.
There's founding fathers at least. Nobody gets the trophy.
No, and there's just so many things you can look to. You can look to home brewing starting up and Charlie Papazi and everything he did. You can look to Fritz and Jack and the things they did. You could look to the things that happened in the 80s and came later and arguably were bigger breweries started more then. Right. Like there's so many different things you can look to. To say there's one single person or thing is kind of foolish.
Yeah, but I mean, there were definitely, I think that she helped give us a better idea of the role that those two guys, being McAuliffe and Maytag, played, and everything that came after that and how it got shaped. And she also brought up this guy, Michael Lewis, who was this professor at University of California, Davis. And this guy, Fritz Maytag takes over Anchor Steam in 1965. 1964, Michael Lewis starts teaching at University of California, Davis. And in 65, he starts teaching home brewing in their extension program.
He wrote one of my favorite scientific brewing books, Brewing.
That's a great title. And that guy, I mean, the fact that he is teaching brewing when it is illegal, and I don't know what the hell an extension program is. I'm assuming it's like, I've taught like community classes, or like non-credit extensions of a university. I'm assuming that's what it was, because it was still illegal to be homebrewing. I mean, he was effectively teaching you how to do something that was technically a crime. But that helps explain part of why Northern California becomes this hub. When we have these two guys, they are not initially connected to Michael Lewis, Fritz Maytag, and Jack McAuliffe, but there are these two guys that are doing something innovative, and then you have this one professor who's starting to specifically educate people on the process. And that starts to explain, I think, why Northern California is the genesis of American craft beer.
You had the people, you had the willpower, you had the infrastructure, and you had the education. It's all the recipes for creating this new industry.
And the counterculture, that idea of buck the system, screw corporate America, local food, all of that. It's this perfect combination of things that starts to come together.
It's really too bad that counterculture didn't stick more. Yeah. Because I feel like we're still fighting those same issues, if not worse, nowadays in 2020. But that's a different aside.
Yeah, that's a whole different tirade.
I think it was really interesting, too, what Dr. McCulla laid up for us about how things progressed so quickly, or really seemingly slowly, from 1965 or so to 1979. And then all of a sudden, boom, something clicked. And then brewery, and now what the consumer knows as the modern craft brewery and the big players in the industry, they kind of all started then. They weren't that first wave.
Right. Well, but that like kind of first, second wave, there was a lot of attrition from that. And a lot of what people know today as the modern craft beer movement really doesn't start until 2010. But yeah, that whole like, the people that are still around, for the most part, really don't happen and don't go into business until we're headed into the 1980s. And yeah, that's right. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, you think about Fritz starting to put together the idea that we need to make better beer in 1965, and it's really not until the 80s that what we think of as the craft beer movement really starts to get its footing.
If I was a giant upon which the craft beer industry was standing upon my shoulders, I would name one shoulder New Albion and the other shoulder Anchor Brewing Company.
If I was a giant, I would have a beanstalk.
Anyway, on that frickin' note, I think it's time we go to the bar and take this conversation a little bit crazier and have a couple more beers.
Cheers, man.
Cheers.
The Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast is a production of Brew Skies Limited in association with 779, a leading video production and content creation agency. With over a decade of experience, 779 works with a wide range of clients, from global brands to boutique startups to mom-and-pop shops. Visit 779video.com for more information. That's the numbers 779video.com. This episode was edited by Dan Fennessy, who is also our executive producer. This podcast was engineered by Adam Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.